So the biggest thing really it comes down to for the companies is to look at what's happening in their company, what they could be exposing their workers to, how they're going to put some controls in place, making sure that the workers understand how to use those controls. Then they have to recheck and make sure everything is being complied with.
Kia ora, I'm Troy, here as Chief Executive, and welcome to Stirring the Pot. Thanks for connecting. If you're new, here's what you can expect. We're going to be talking the tough stuff, the things that keep us middle minds up at night. There are many challenges facing our industry and equally many opinions on how we should tackle them. Stirring the Pot provides a facilitated forum to discuss and challenge these viewpoints.
So let's get to the nuts and bolts of it. Today we're having a kōrero with Patrick Fenemor, here our senior welding engineer around health and safety in welding. You've been in heavy fabrication for years. What got you first into welding, and more importantly, what drew you to health and safety side of things?
I started an apprenticeship back in the 70s. In those days, you had a choice of working in office, working on the tools. So I did an apprenticeship, marine engineering. Safety was there, but not as prominent. And so I had a diverse exposure to welding, marine, fabrication. And from there, I moved on to a petrochemical plant. So in a petrochemical plant, of course, is a totally different kettle of fish where safety is number one. In the level of that, I learnt firefighting, I learnt first aid, advanced first aid, but everything was so safety driven. And so I learned to be very compliant. For there, I got a lot of experience in training, and some of my training was in safety products and processes. From there, I shifted back to Nelson for a period, and I worked at a town bottling plant doing milk. I was an engineer, and because of my experience doing health and safety within the petrochemical, I expanded on the role there, became health and safety manager as well as engineer, and developed a lot of their processes within the organisation. And following that, I went into working for a industrial gases company as a specialist, and I got exposed back into the welding field throughout New Zealand, but it's been a sort of a journey and getting up to the level that we are now.
Yeah. So you've been really involved or exposed to health and safety from early on in your career?
There's a lot about welding, but a lot about just general safety. And so I've had a lot of safety tickets in the past, and I've done confined space, I've done, as I say, firefighting, I've done industrial gases training. And so because of that, it gives me a broad knowledge of the things people can be exposed to in their day-to-day environment. And it's not just for welding, but for other people that may be exposed in their day-to-day that may be influenced by the welding environment.
Cool. Yeah, let's focus a bit on the welding process. What are the real dangers there facing people doing the welding, and maybe those who are around?
Well, welding is such a diverse process. So when I served my apprenticeship, we had a lot of oxy-fuel welding, so oxyacetylene. We did stick welding, the old manual metal arc welding. And so from that, it was a limited exposure. But I was also doing machining, and we used to machine pipes that had asbestos in them. And so the person operating the lathe had one mask on their face, and everyone walking by was exposed to the particles. But didn't understand the hazards in those days. Noise, hearing because a lot of industrial noise comes in the engineering field. And we used to wear some hearing protection at times. And it was interesting, sort of an aside, is that with the hearing, when I started at the petrochemical plant, my hearing had been sort of average. On the petrochemical site, it was compulsory that everyone wore their shade 5 or level 5 hearing protection at all times. My hearing actually improved back to near perfect, and the industrial nurse took my samples away to a conference on audiometry, which was a demonstration to me that even though I'd used some hearing safety protection, I hadn't used enough, and I hadn't used it correctly. I hadn't been trained to. And so that sort of put in the direction of going through. But in welding, you've got fume, electricity, and electricity is sort of dear to me. I've actually been on a site where a person died from electrocution, so I'm very aware of the hazards that are associated with that. There's welding fume, there's radiation, a lot of radiations that are unseen. Even the fume, we can see fume, but there's a lot of fume generated in the welding that is unseen, that people don't understand and don't comprehend of how it can affect people. And as sort of things have gone on, it's become more prevalent. It's now been identified as a carcinogen, the welding fume. So as such, the level of requirements that people are facing become more and more, but technology is changing in the way that it can control some of these measures. But you can have also within the industry, there's burns, there's injuries to, I've crushed fingers, I've crushed bones, there's fatigue from incorrect techniques. There's so many different things that people can be exposed to just in general day-to-day welding, that it is an industry that really takes an understanding to make sure you're looking after people's safety.
And there are also a lot of risks that are not of immediate effect, like the exposure to fumes. We don't see immediately that something has gone wrong, but only over time do you get the problems.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, like asbestosis. As I said, I used to machine pipes that actually had asbestos reinforcing them. I used to do boiler legging that used asbestos rope for legging the boilers and legging pipework. Now, with that asbestos, it was only in about the 70s that they identified the effects of exposure to the asbestos and asbestosis. And so you can be up to 25 years it can take for the effects to be seen for people to actually succumb to asbestosis. Recently, there's been a lot of work on the silicon bench tops and fabricated concrete. And so with that, they can generate silicosis. Now, silicosis is now a 5-year term. And so it's things that you may have thought were bad, you knew they were bad, you just didn't know how bad they were. And now that welding fume has been identified as a carcinogen, that's one which is on a lot of people's mind, to make sure that they're taking the precautions, because we don't know how quickly it can affect and what the long-term effects are, apart from it can be a carcinogen depending on the susceptibility of a person.
You talked about when you started your apprenticeships and the type of welding you had using gases quite a bit, or gas welding. With new processes and technology coming along, are these reducing the risk?
No, there's definitely some processes, and it's quite interesting. So I served an apprenticeship, I went through the training schools, and I was taught the basics of just talking about gas and the safe use of oxy-fuels. And I've had to, when I took up my role as a welding specialist for the gas company, is I had to relearn a lot of the information I'd been taught, because either I'd interpreted incorrectly or I hadn't been taught correctly. And so I had to relearn to make sure that I was teaching other people the correct and safe way. And that's one of the problems with just the understanding the correct way. Now, when it comes to gases, there's not much change in the technology, but when it comes to the other processes, welding, stick welding, we've got MIG welding, we've got TIG welding, we've identified, and there's new changes in the technology of the equipment, which generates a lot less fume, a lot less radiation. I talked about, I've worked with a chap that got electrocuted. They now bring in almost all devices have what's called a VRD, voltage reduction device, and so that will make it healthier or less potential for electrocution. So they're bringing in devices. So the new technology is coming up with methods to reduce the form. It can be the gases, it can be the consumable, it can be the processes built into the machines. All of these things are being developed without adding extra control measures. So that's still the basic equipment is now becoming much more sophisticated. But we do have some issues or some other things coming in, like new technologies. And new technologies include laser. So where lasers were a thing which was inside a box which was fully controlled, It's now a handheld process, and they can become relatively portable. When it comes to welding and the radiation can be generated from a normal welding arc, you need to isolate areas within your boundary of 10 metres. When it comes to isolating when you're working with lasers, it's 250 metres. Now, a lot of people aren't aware of the requirements that comes in with the new technology. And so it means that people need to be educated, need to understand, need to do their research.
So I guess when you melt metals and you're in close proximity to that process, there will always be some residual danger that we can't fully avoid.
And that's correct. So, some are obvious. It can be glowing red. You can see the fume, but you can't see the electricity. You can't see the radiation. You can't see the gaseous fume. So it's an inherent process that has these issues built into it that you can't get away from. So you need to look at some way of controlling the exposure of the people and making sure that there's a less potential for any harm.
I mean, as a company, what do I really have to do? Where are my responsibilities in managing these risks?
So the big thing, there's been some big changes. We can go back to the introduction of the Health and Safety at Work Act. So where that whole sort of process came about, beforehand, the Act, we almost had the people doing the checking to make sure people were complying were also the trainers, and so there was quite often some conflicts of interest in that whole process. So when that Act came around, what we've come up with is that it came out as a result of the Pike River. Now, a lot of people lost their lives, and a lot of people, their bodies are still in the mine. But when you go through the research paper, there were a lot of things fell down because people weren't complying. People didn't understand the hazards, didn't understand the risk. So what we're looking at, what people have to do, is they need to identify within their workplace where are the workers going to be exposed. And it's not just the person working on the tool, it can be a person walking through that environment. Who's going to be exposed to the hazard? Then they need to look at how we might be able to control some of those exposures. How can we sort of mitigate or minimise the risk of that exposure? And we need to discuss as an industry what one person is doing, can that be used somewhere else? They need to communicate. But there's also the people that are exposed. We need to provide them with training. We need to, under this day and age, there's a lot of documentation required where we need to start keeping a track of who's been trained, how they've been trained, make sure there's some sort of documentation that confirms that they understand what they're doing and that processes are being followed. So the biggest thing really it comes down to for the companies is to look at what's happening in their company, what they could be exposing their workers to, how they're going to put some controls in place, then making sure that the controls are in place so they're working effectively, making sure that the workers understand how to use those controls, and then they have to recheck and make sure everything is being complied with. And so really it comes down to looking, opening the eyes, not just waiting until someone comes and taps you on the shoulder.
Mm-hmm. As a company, do you need to prove this or show this to somebody? If you have gone through your assessment and implemented your controls and your measures?
So the biggest thing is that there's a lot of standards involved within the industry for different aspects of the safety. So people need to have a look, so they need to actually make sure that they're looking for the right issues and the right solutions to meet the standards within. So it can be the eyewear. So there are standards with eyewear on how it can be used, how it can be fitted, how it can be, what protection it will offer, the applications that could be used. So they need to understand. Then the organisations need to do documentation to make sure that they've confirmed that they have looked at the right information, that they have then done their tests to see how they comply with those standards, and then once they get compliance, that they've put in the controls and those controls are working. So it's all about that documenting and making sure that if someone comes through to do an investigation, they can show that, yes, we've talked to the people, we've found out what's happening, we've talked to other people in the industry to find out what they're doing, and we're making sure that we're being effective in how we're protecting our workers.
That's quite a bit of a process. Could you give us maybe a bit of a brief intro on how companies could go about identifying these risks and managing them?
When they introduced the New Zealand Health and Safety Work Act, they also brought in WorkSafe. Now, WorkSafe became the body which administers and makes sure that people are complying. But WorkSafe, as an organisation, they can provide a lot of training tools, they can provide a lot of resource material, some links for people to make sure that they can understand what they need to be doing and the standards they need to be meeting to protect their workers. So that's one area, is they can talk to WorkSafe and get some advice. So there's a lot of advice on the WorkSafe site. They can talk to other people within the industry, because welding is so widely diverse within New Zealand that what works for one company isn't necessarily going to work for another company. It can be due to the size, but it could be to the materials they're working with. It could be to do with the consumables they're using. So they've got to make sure they're talking to people within their own industry to then compare notes to see what someone else is doing, to see if they haven't missed something that they could use as a protection for their workers. So that they need to look for reports. So some of the suppliers of the safety equipment, they produce documented papers and research papers that demonstrate how using equipment safely and correctly can reduce the exposure to fume, or to not just fume, but to other things. And so it's looking at the documentation, talking to suppliers, talking to safety organisations, talking to, there's a lot of companies that will do the research and actually will come on site and do audits. But they need to be doing something to show, and then documenting to show that they're looking at what exposures they could be coming across.
Where does HERA sit in this game?
So we're a non-for-profit organisation. We're not here promoting one product over another, but we do have quite a substantial membership. And what we are doing is we want to make sure that if there is some confusion from our memberships, we can point them in the right direction. So we're not going to give them the answers. We're not going to promote any particular company over another, but we'll look at the options where they're having some issues. We're going to look at the options that they have. We're going to maybe guide them, give them some suggestions of where they can go for relevant information. We have done some reports, and for the laser welding, we've done a report which is quite a comprehensive sort of document. So we are coming out with some research. I've got a webinar series coming up, which is going to be discussing, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the standards, where they've come from, the standards that need to be looked at and complied with. A little bit about the organisations where some of that support materials is available, but then I'm also going to be looking at what some of the key issues that our welders are exposed to. So welding fume, radiation, electrocution, fire exposure. I'm going to be going through what the hazards are, and then go through the structure using the hierarchy of controls, and go through what can be offered because you can't completely remove welding, you can't eliminate it as a process. It's there. So what we've got to do is look at ways to minimise. And so I'll be looking at ways you can use some substitutions, some of the controls that can be put in place, some of the engineering controls, and also down as far as the PPE. A lot of people still look at PPE as the first option. PPE should still be the last option. It's the last of the hierarchy of controls. It's the last option to look at. So there are other methods to look at and before we look at PPE, and that's something that I'll be exposing or going through as I go through all these different hazards that welders can be exposed to.
We also talk quite a bit of Industry 4, and we talked about compliance. Is there anything coming up in terms of tools or technology that helps companies to stay on top of compliance?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of companies now coming out with electronic documentation, and what under this day and age, instead everyone has a smartphone with them, and by having the documentation and some of the processes on a phone on electronic media, it's then at the person's fingertips. They can access that information before they go on site, and they can do checklists before they go on site. They can understand the hazards that are going to in a particular environment. They can also understand what's been introduced as control measures and make sure they understand those control measures. So it's a way of electronically documenting that process. So it also, for companies, organisations, it helps them with compliance by having people actually being able to acknowledge that they have accessed that information, seen that information, and that they've read and understood that information. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, there are companies now coming out that meet that sort of Industry 4 process of coming up with information so we can log where people are doing. But the second part of Industry 4, it's not just about logging the information. The second part is using the information and the outcomes of that data. Mm-hmm. And that's where you can use that. You can see which people aren't logging in. You can see which people aren't complying. And so then you can use that as an education tool to bring them so that everyone is now working in their best to achieve that safety goal.
In comparison to a paper form, I guess, that goes out inside, you don't have to wait until at the end of the day, end of the shift, the paper form is collected and then transcribed.
Yep.
To see this information, but you can react almost in real time to what's happening on site, even though you're not quite there.
And what can happen when it comes to Industry 4 type stuff or the electronic type stuff is people can be aware or made aware if situations change. So if you have working on a building site, so a lot of our welders, they'll work on fabrication sites, and all of a sudden a crane arrives that was scheduled for the following day, but it arrives today. Mm-hmm. So they've now got a new range of hazards of a crane on site, vehicle movement, lifting, and so all of that can be sent out automatically to anyone on that site, and straight away the people are aware of the change in the situation. Whereas before you had to have communication, someone physically had to go around try and find the welders or the workers on the site to actually make sure everyone is aware of those situations. With an electronic system, it's now going to make it so much easier and quicker to monitor and keep people informed of the hazards they could be exposed to.
Now we've touched on a lot of things, technology, the change, compliance. You also said you have got a webinar coming up. Who are the people you would like to see at the webinar?
So at the webinar, it's basically going to be across the board, because we need people like the people that run the companies that are going to be responsible for providing the safe tools. They need to understand the Act. So my first session is going to be aimed more at those people so that they get an understanding of their requirements. So understand under the Act, I'll be giving an overview of the different reference tools and some of the information. So that one there is about understanding how to comply or make sure why they have to comply and how to comply. The second two sessions are going to be basically pulling apart the different hazards and risks and the possible control measures of the exposures. So that's going to be the one that'll be anyone. So it'll be for the people that have to bring in the safety control measures, but also it may make people aware, the ones that are actually using those control measures, that there are other things out there that they can think about and look at and be aware of. So it's an awareness thing. So basically it's a one which is everyone involved in the welding industry should be able to get something out of it.
I guess that goes with the saying, health and safety, it's everybody's responsibility.
It's everyone's responsibility. It's all about getting home safe. And the more that you understand, the more that you know, then the safer you're going to be, more chance of going home.
So there you go. Thanks for joining our conversation with Patrick today. If you'd like to connect more with him, you'll find his details in the show notes. Welding and fabrication will always come with risks, but with the right knowledge, the right tools, and the right mindset, we can build safer workplaces for everyone. It's not just about compliance, it's about culture, care, and keeping our people safe. So whether you're on the tools, managing a team, or shaping policy, take a moment to ask yourselves, are you doing enough? Food for thought till we see you next time. So hit subscribe, and if you like what you heard today, please like, review, or share with any metal minds you know. Let's spread the word. If today's kōrero has got you thinking about how to improve safety in your workplace, then don't miss our upcoming 3-part webinar series on health and safety in welding. Patrick will dive deeper into the biggest risks, the control measures that actually work, and how to make sure you're meeting your responsibilities under WorkSafe. To register to attend, you'll find the details in the show notes.